Hello everybody, this is Video Game Growing Pains, and I am back to talk Final Fantasy VII. Before I do though, a little background. Square was mostly a Nintendo company before Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy 1 through 3 was released on the Famicom, with 1 being released in the States on the NES. We had 4 and 6, as well as 5 in Japan, released on the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo. So it was a big surprise when Final Fantasy jumped ship to the PlayStation when the Super Nintendo's time was up. There was even a tech demo of Final Fantasy VI in 3D being shown off on the Nintendo 64. Yet, Square stood by their decision. They wanted the processing power of CD, and that is what they got. Final Fantasy VII was probably one of the most influential RPGs in history, which is a little ironic when you think about it. A lot of what it does isn't new, and a lot of what it does was very 90s. It was very dark for the sake of dark, very grim, very different. But it showed the potential of cinematic storytelling and of the RPG to be an engaging and fun experience to the mainstream public, not just the niche audiences. So, we should actually be quite glad of that. It kept the RPG going, even with the larger budgets of the current generation. Now, one thing I want everyone to keep in mind before I continue. Final Fantasy VII has largely been credited as an incomplete or an unfinished game. A lot of it was taken out to match time crunches and storage limitations. In fact, the game was released on 3 separate discs, which was unheard of at the time. But more on that later. So, a lot of the things that we have problems with, some of the poor script and translation, some of the lacking plot points which should have gone more, had to be taken out. Which leads to some interesting sequelage. We'll get there. We'll get to Final Fantasy VII sequels. But first, let's talk the original game. Final Fantasy VII was the first attempt at Squaresoft at a 3D Final Fantasy world. And it was absolutely hideous. Yeah, starting with graphics here, Final Fantasy VII tried to use 3D, and it was absolutely ugly. Even back when it was first released, everyone was wowed by it, but they were also kind of turned off by it. The characters were very blocky and polygonal, and some of their joints were held together by just a single pixel. Their arms looked like pentahedrons, which were held together at the very tip to other pentahedrons, which made up their arms and shoulders. It was very bizarre. This was just on the field, though. In battle, characters had a much more refined look, and, well, were almost human. That was probably the big selling point of it, was these battle scenes, because they showed a much more, not realistic, but a much more detailed battle system and a much more detailed character system. Also, Final Fantasy VII was known for having cinematics, pre-rendered cutscenes that used a stronger graphical engine than the game could offer to tell certain parts of the story. This might become a problem later, depending on, well, what your side of the fence on the cinematic issues, but at the time, it was jaw-droppingly impressive, and it made for some very useful moments in battle as well, but we'll get there. So, the graphics of Final Fantasy VII were poor. The polygonal graphics were very ugly. The hand-drawn backgrounds were very nice, but anything 3D came together with the hand-drawn backgrounds with a decided clunk. It was very awkward to look at times. In battle, however, the graphics of the characters and the designs of the enemies were quite striking. This was a much more technological world, where robots and humanoid creatures were more common, though we did still get some monsters. And we also got some very unusual character designs, different from anything Yoshitaka Amano gave us, which is why I talked last time about the graphical differences. Tetsuya Nomura's graphical style was very much more modern, based on Japanese fashion and, well, a little bit of over-design. But it worked. It was such a departure from Final Fantasy, but while keeping the core of the series, that it invigorated the fans. It divided a few too, but we'll get to that as well. So, graphically, the game had a lot going for it. Except, of course, for the polygons. In battle, beautiful. The cutscenes, for the time, amazing. Everywhere else, oh god in heaven, why? But graphics aren't everything. What about the story? Well, like I said, there's parts of it that just are really stupid. In fact, there's parts of it that are brilliant, but well, let me start from the beginning. Cloud Strife is a soldier, a mercenary who's working for a terrorist group called Avalanche. Their goal is to defeat the Shinra Electric Company, which uses fear, subversion, elite secret police to silence enemies, to bully people into taking their power from them, and to use their electric company's influence to gain money. It's an evil corporation instead of an evil empire this time, and a much more modern twist. This is not steampunk, this is a more modern setting. Like I said, we still have moshes and everything, but it was a departure. So, Cloud, because of a connection to one of the members of Avalanche, his childhood friend Tifa, decides to stick around with them. He ends up meeting a young woman named Eris, and they all sort of become embroiled in this giant plot. Eris, this last legacy of an ancient race, and the reemergence of the wicked soldier Sephiroth, strongest of Shinra, the electric company's, experimental soldiers. He went AWOL and became some sort of monster. And they get to meet a lot of interesting characters, go to some very varied places, and it's an interesting story, I'll say that much. There are times when it's very dumb. For example, at one point, Cloud Strife and his friends, Tifa and Eris, have to infiltrate the manor of a lecherous baron. To do so, Cloud Strife dresses up in drag. Yeah, we have a lot of really what moments like that. For example, the bikini brief-wearing owner of a casino named Dio throws you in jail, and he throws you into a prison at the bottom of a desert. We have unbelievably weird moments where you were hiding as a soldier and you literally talk to guys who you probably should be killing and just ignore them. The story has some good moments too. Despite the awkward script, we get a lot of great character pieces. Cloud goes through some personality breakdowns. Tifa goes through some survivor's guilt and choices to try and decide whether she wants to interrupt with her friend's love and whether she wants to actually be a part of his life. Barrett, the choice of being a father, and it just goes on. With the exception of Vincent Valentine, who gets a nice story in the sequels, everyone, including the side character Yuffie, gets some story development and some character growth, and it's very invigorating. And we do get a character death here, a main character death. Not the first one in the series, but it was the one that was sort of what put RPGs on the map. The death heard round the world when Eris Gainsborough dies to Sephiroth. The story has a lot more twists than just that, though. It's a very compelling take on some modern trends, such as the over-reliance on corporations, the dangers of propaganda, and, in many ways, the futility of terrorism over just trying to do what you can without hurting others. But, like I said, the story has some problems. The dialogue can be very stilted at times, and we have those awkward situations. Still, overall, it's quite interesting. Now, we've talked story, we've talked graphics. How about the battle system? The battle system is very good. It's much redesigned from Final Fantasy VI. Instead of the 4 armor pieces you could have in 6, or the even more you could have in previous games, you get 1 weapon, 1 armor. And all of your abilities come from the materia you can equip into those weapons and armor. Materia is everything. It gives you special abilities like the ability to steal or the ability to use blue magic, here called command skills, enemy skills. And it gives you a lot of other abilities. It can increase your HP. It can give you the ability to use regular magic like fire or ice. And it can make summons appear. The summons in Final Fantasy VII were another thing that were very impressive. Because if they could use longer cutscenes in the game, they were able to create very long, very detailed summon scenes where you would summon gigantic monsters who would just destroy your opponents. And it was very jaw-dropping to watch for the first time. Bahamut the Dragon King, who was mentioned in previous Final Fantasies, got 3 summons all to his own. And the most powerful summon in the game could last upwards of 3 minutes in length, where you just sit watching 13 knights crush your enemies. It was an impressive little, well, shall we say, twist. Now, Materia was more than just commands. You could also build combos with it. For example, equipping a materia that hits everything with a magic allows you to hit everything. Equipping a materia that allows you to do final attack with a revive spell will heal your party. And it goes on like that. Materia gained experience just like the characters, and it could level up and learn new abilities. This took forever to do. And it let you customize your characters. Did they want to be a damage magnet and have no materia, or did they want to be a spellcaster? All the characters did have some unique growth, though. For example, Eris was more used to magic, but Cloud was more of a middle-of-the-road character. He was able to fight and use magic. This was helped by the fact that not only did characters have their own unique battle animations, but they had limit breaks, super skills which they could use in a pinch to get out of trouble. Some of them would paralyze enemies, some of them would do insane damage, some of them were comboed together with other skills, some of them would heal. There was a lot of variety in what your characters could do, and it made them both distinct, memorable, and it made you feel pretty powerful too. The battle system was active time battle. It focused on the timing system. But it was a nice takeoff from Final Fantasy VI. It was very unique in its own way, where you got a lot of the customization of 5 without being restricted to job classes. You could do almost anything you wanted. Yet the character still felt very unique. Very nicely done. Nobuo Uematsu's music is probably one of the big standouts here. It got a chance to be a bit darker with the grimmer tone of Final Fantasy VII, but the added power of the CD gave it much more room to flourish. We could get orchestral soundtracks now, and more than that, we could get vocal soundtracks. I love a lot of the themes in Final Fantasy VII, including Still More Fighting, Eris' theme, and the Overworld theme. But the theme which takes the cake is the One-Winged Angel. Nobuo Uematsu created a haunting theme for the final battle with Sephiroth that used a choir to actually sing parts of the lyrics, and it was hauntingly scary and beautiful. Now, I talked about all the different parts of the game. It had a lot of extras that Final Fantasy VI had as well. There were lots of places you could go. But unlike 6, which focused on new dungeons and new enemies, Final Fantasy VII was the first to introduce serious mini-games. Things like you have to breathe into a girl to give her CPR. You can go to a casino and gamble, play mini-games there. And it was pretty fun. We got some secret bosses too. There was a lot of content, including 2 secret characters. It wasn't as much as Final Fantasy VI, but it was still pretty cool. You could do a lot in Final Fantasy VII. If you wanted to get all of the materia, you could even go chocobo breeding. You could breed the big yellow birds and race them. That was quite something. I think they went a little overboard with some of them because some of the items you needed to find required hours of chocobo breeding. And Final Fantasy VII, I will say this, is less grindy than the other games, but some of the activities felt like they would force you to grind too, so bit of a problem there. I do want to take off for a moment to talk about Sephiroth, though. Final Fantasy VII got a chance to do something that we had only dreamed of in previous games. It got a chance to really strike the audience with its visuals. And yes, the blocky characters were really stupid, including Sephiroth, but the painted backgrounds gave us a hint of what could be with this 3D technology. My favorite scene in regards to this is there's a gigantic snake that the party has to ride a chocobo to get away from. It's called a Midgard's Loom. If you fight it, you're almost certainly going to die because it's so powerful. Well, after you get away from it, you see a painted scene where one of these gigantic cobra-like beasts has been impaled upon a tree by Sephiroth. And it just strikes you as how cruel and how powerful and how scary he is. We'd seen Kefka in Final Fantasy VI poison rivers and do insane things, but this was the first time we'd ever seen someone just a showing of brute strength so overpowering in a visual style. It was so graphic. You could see the dead body of the snake propped up there, and this was only the beginning. We had many more scenes of Sephiroth's power to come. How he rips through a dragon, how he just destroys an entire village. it gave us a sort of haunting connection with the main villain. And that would not have been possible without the CD technology. I really think they did the best they could with what they had. Granted, it would get better with time, but I still quite like a lot of the psychological imagery and some of the moments in Final Fantasy VII. Sephiroth himself is often accused of being a mama's boy due to his Oedipus complex with his. I don't want to say Mother Genova because that's not entirely true, but it's too complicated to explain here. It's in the story. But at the same time, Sephiroth's a very dark villain who's, well, he's a little bit like Kefka. He does sort of report to Genova, but at the same time, he's very much his own entity, and he's very cruel, but also much more controlled and composed than Kefka, who was very chaotic. It was a nice take. I admit to having a little bit of bias with Final Fantasy VII, because when I played it, I was still in my adolescence, about the age of 10 to 12. I loved the character designs. I was a big fan of the darker tone, and Cloud Strife wielding a sword that was as big as him. Cloud being one of my favorite characters. That being said, I'm not afraid to talk about the flaws of Final Fantasy VII. The script was very bad. The graphic style is atrocious. Even back then it was atrocious. The story occasionally meanders, and we do lose track of the story a little later in the game, where we start going on fetch quests to actually finish things. And the thing is, the fetch quests are kind of mandatory. Some of them are nice, where you go back to old places and have to save them from invaders, but it feels very much like a rehash rather than moving forward, which is what we've been doing all the way up through the game. Some of the environments are very unpleasant to go through, dingy and a little depressing. They're not as beautiful, even in their destruction, as Final Fantasy VI, 5, or 4 were. And really, there was just something missing, I think. Some of that steampunk element, some of that Yoshitaka Amano magic, that dreamlike nature that let us reveal that it was in a fantasy world. Yet, it was still decidedly Final Fantasy. So despite these problems, it was still pretty good, I must say. Final Fantasy VII is very good. I won't say it's great, because the graphical style really does hold it back, as does the story. But a lot of people bash on it, and I don't think that's fair. A lot of people bash on Final Fantasy VII because it was such a departure. We had this grimmer tone, we had it jumped from consoles, a lot of fans felt betrayed, but looking back, Final Fantasy VII was an interesting change. It showed Square trying to evolve the series, the genre, showing the world what RPGs could really do, and I for one appreciated that. It was very cool. Now, Final Fantasy VII had a lot of supplementary material that, as we talked about, because some of the script was cut. Characters who only barely get mentioned in Final Fantasy VII have a lot of time devoted to them in the sequels. So before we move on to Final Fantasy VIII, I'm going to talk about the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. All of the sequels related to Final Fantasy VII that came after the game. Some many years after. So, that's what I'm doing next time. Next time, Video Game Growing Pains talks about the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. See you then.